Morning, everyone. We're going to look at Nebuchadnezzar's secret dream, if you're up for that. I guess a lot of people might know about Daniel. I think if you ask people on the street, they might know about Daniel in the lion's den. It's sort of a Sunday school story. I don't think many of them will potentially know about the vision that comes in Daniel chapter 2 that we're going to look at today. I don't think they'll know much more about Daniel other than this story of Daniel in the lion's den, perhaps. But Daniel was taken as a captive when the king Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon went across into Israel. This is going back, so you're looking at about give or take 600 years before Jesus was born. That's when these events are happening, give or take a few years. Babylon at the time, which is in where modern day Iraq is, had this despotic king called Nebuchadnezzar who was taking over territory. He goes into Israel, takes some captives. One of them was this chap called Daniel. So Daniel was a Jew, and he was taken captive and actually made it into Nebuchadnezzar's court because he was very intelligent. He was also very good looking, apparently, and Nebuchadnezzar latched on to him and others as well that he had taken captive. And Daniel sort of rose up in the ranks. What happened was, while Daniel was there as captive, but sort of working directly for King Nebuchadnezzar, this Babylonian despotic king, God put into Nebuchadnezzar's mind a dream. It's an amazing dream. And what it turns out is, and this is what I'm going to show you, is God detailing out history in advance in a sort of symbolic way, which becomes the basis of other visions and dreams that came afterwards to Nebuchadnezzar and to Daniel. And in fact becomes the basis, I think, for the whole of the book of Revelation, which is the last book of the Bible, which is also full of signs and symbols. So I almost think if you can understand the basics of Daniel chapter 2, it helps you unlock a lot of other prophecy as well. So what I'm going to show you now is what the dream was that Nebuchadnezzar had. Now, I built this in PowerPoint, and at the end of this little talk, I'm going to show you somebody that's put it graphically together a lot better than my very poor PowerPoint skills. But I'm going to show you what I put together. This is years ago, I put this together in PowerPoint. And what you're going to hear is word for word, Daniel chapter 2, not the whole chapter. I've just picked out the bit where we're hearing about the vision. But you're going to hear what the vision was that Nebuchadnezzar had. And as I say, I've put some graphics on the screen that sort of explain it.
Chapter 2. In the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled and he could not sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them,
"I have had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means."
Arioch took Daniel to the king at once and said,
"I have found a man among the exiles from Judah who can tell the king what his dream means."
The king asked Daniel, also called Belteshazzar,
"Are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it?"
Daniel replied,
"No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. Your dream and the visions that passed through your mind as you lay on your bed are these. As you were lying there, O king, your mind turned to things to come, and the revealer of mysteries showed you what is going to happen. As for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because I have greater wisdom than other living men, but so that you, O king, may know the interpretation, and that you may understand what went through your mind. You looked, O king, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. The head of the statue was made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were broken to pieces at the same time and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace. But the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream. And now we will interpret it to the king.
Right, so that was the dream. Something like that, probably much more spectacular than my graphics there, okay? So what we're about to find out is that all this image with these different metals are empires and subsequent empires that we're going to follow after Babylon. And then somebody tell me what happened at the end. So you got this big image with all these different metals. What happened then? A stone. What did it say in particular? It was cut out without hands, right? Every single solitary video I've ever watched, right, when you look at the way they depict it, shows a rough sort of jaggedy rock that comes out of heaven and hits the image on the feet. But I haven't done that. I've done it as a did you see it was like an exact square cube? Why do you think I might have done that in relation to the words that say it was cut out of a mountain without hands? It looks cut. If it's a raggedy rock, you wouldn't necessarily say that was cut out of the mountain, would you? And the more I thought about it, the more I thought the only way something looks cut out of the mountain is if it was something that was like a cube. Well, it could be a cube or it could be an oblong. But then I thought it probably is maybe a cube. Now, this rock comes, this stone that's cut out of the mountain comes and does what? Yeah, exactly. It hits the image on the feet, it says, and then it grinds the whole image to powder and the whole thing disappears. But then what happens to the stone? Becomes a mountain and fills the whole earth. So if all these metals represent the kingdoms of men like empires, there's a little stone that comes out of sort of nowhere that's cut out without hands. So this is something to, if something's cut without hands, what does that make you think of? Makes you think of God, doesn't it? Because if it's if a human cuts something, it's a human cutting it. Something cut out beautifully without hands says to me this is supernatural. Would you? And if it's supernatural, it's God. So God's behind the cutting out of this stone that comes down and hits the image, which grinds all these empires of men to nothing. But then this little stone grows and grows. Now, what do you think this little stone might represent? This perfect little cube of a stone that hits the image and then grows and becomes a great big mountain itself. Jesus. I think it's talking about Jesus. And in fact, of course, if you look at Ephesians chapter 2, verse 20, we're told that Jesus himself is the cornerstone. And a cornerstone is always perfect, isn't it? If you've got a wonky cornerstone and try and line up a building going off at rights and however you do it, you're going to get a wonky building if the cornerstone's wonky. So when we had an extension out the back of our house, Nigel, our neighbour, spent ages lining up the corner. And he spent ages doing it and getting that first brick in position because everything was going to come off that brick. And that's exactly what this is. So this stone cut out, and was Jesus effectively like a stone cut out without human hands? Well, he was, wasn't he? Because Jesus was born of a virgin. God it was that got Mary pregnant effectively through what? How did he get Mary? Through the Holy Spirit. It says that the Holy Spirit overshadowed Mary. She became pregnant, gave birth to Jesus. Jesus was born through the power of God. No man was involved in it. So this little stone comes down, and it's small to start with, isn't it? But it doesn't stay small. It grows and grows and grows and fills the entire world. What might that be talking about? The kingdom to come. Jesus comes back. It isn't like an instantaneous worldwide kingdom, I don't think, is it, when Jesus comes back? There's 1,000 years for the kingdom of God to be put into place. And okay, it might not take to the very last second of the 1,000 years for Jesus to establish the worldwide kingdom, but it's certainly going to take some time. It's not wave a wand and Jesus is suddenly king over everything. It's going to take some time. The other interesting thing is, if you've got your Bibles open, if you have a look at Daniel chapter 2 and verse 45, it says, "For as much as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands." So what you've got there is the stone is cut out of a mountain. Where is Jesus actually going to return from, by the way? Where's he returning from? Heaven, right? So when Jesus returns, he's coming from heaven. But then if you have a look at verse 35, here's the little stone, by the way. Look, there's the mountain. The stone is cut out. It comes down and hits the image on the feet. The image then is ground to powder. But if you have a look at verse 35, it says that the little stone itself at the end of the verse smote the image and the stone became a great mountain. So in other words, the stone is cut out from a mountain. It comes and hits the image and the stone then becomes a mountain. So really there are two mountains, aren't there? There's a mountain where the stone comes from and there's a mountain that the stone grows into. Do you see what I'm saying? So when it says the stone grows, it says it becomes a mountain. Now here's the thing. Jesus, as we've just said, is a stone that comes from heaven, because that's where Jesus is right now. So the stone is cut out, and God one day is going to say to Jesus, "I want you to go back to the earth," isn't he? It says that God's going to say that. "Son, today is the day. I want you to go back to earth, and I want you to establish what? The kingdom on earth." In other words, God's kingdom right now is in heaven, but God, through Jesus, is going to set up a new kingdom here on earth called the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven. By the way, it doesn't say the kingdom in heaven, does it? The kingdom of God here on earth is not the kingdom in heaven. It's going to be the kingdom of heaven here on earth. So this whole vision that Nebuchadnezzar's being given is pretty amazing, because it's God saying in advance, "I am going to replace the kingdoms of men with my own kingdom through a stone cut out symbolically that I've created, and he's going to do it." Now you might say, how do we really know what the image itself represents? How do we know that the gold, the silver, the bronze and the iron are to do with nations even? In fact, of course, Nebuchadnezzar, one, couldn't remember the dream when you read Daniel chapter 2, and then he certainly didn't know what it meant either. But Daniel was shown what God had put into Nebuchadnezzar's mind and revealed what it meant as well. And here is the interpretation. And actually, the good news is it's in the same chapter. So Daniel in chapter 2 and verse 38 interprets it. But this isn't Daniel's interpretation, as he makes clear. God has revealed this to Daniel. Here we go. Daniel says to Nebuchadnezzar, "Thou art this head of gold, and after you is going to rise another kingdom inferior to yours. Another third kingdom of brass will bear rule over the earth, and the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, for as much as iron breaks in pieces and subdues all things, and as iron breaks all these, so shall it break in pieces and bruise. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men," whatever all this means, "but they shall cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. And in the days of these kings," in other words, the toe kings at the very, very end, shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. That's what we've just been talking about for the last 10 minutes. That God is establishing a kingdom that's going to replace the kingdoms of men. So, there's 4 different metals. There's the gold, there's the silver, then there's bronze, then there's iron. And Daniel is saying through God that these are different empires that are going to roll after Nebuchadnezzar, who was the first. He is the head of gold. He says, you are the head of gold. Which was, by the way, which empire? Babylon. But Babylon didn't last forever, did it? It came to an end. You can look this up in Encyclopedia Britannica or on Wikipedia nowadays. It didn't last forever. It came to an end. Anybody know which empire came after the Babylonian Empire? The Medes and the Persians. You get 10 points for that, Warren. Well done. I've just put Persia there, but the Medo-Persian Empire is a fuller way of putting it. But the Medo-Persian Empire came next. That is represented by the silver because that's the empire that followed straight after. And as Richard just was pointing out, there's 2 arms to this 2 arms, and they represent the Medes and the Persians. We then get on to another empire that followed after the Medo-Persian Empire, which was which empire? Well, under Alexander the Great. Very good. It's the Greek Empire came next. So the Greek Empire came next under Alexander the Great, and lots of things happened in that Greek Empire that we know about. So this is, if you imagine, these are chapter headings. That's the way I tend to look at Daniel chapter 2. Other chapters in Daniel fill in an enormous amount of detail. Just within the Greek Empire, God tells us what was going to happen to Alexander the Great, how he was going to die, who was going to follow after him, how the kingdom of Greece split into 4 different areas, what happened with the generals who took over it. All of it's there in Daniel, but these are chapter headings. Who came after Greece? The Roman Empire came after that. Which then leaves a bit of a puzzle, because to my knowledge, the Roman Empire came to an end some time ago. And there's a bit of a debate as to the exact year that it did. Some say around about 376 AD, which is, to my calculation, in the region of 1,700 years ago that the Roman Empire ceased to exist. But the weird thing is, of course, Jesus hasn't come back yet, has he, to my knowledge? But we're therefore down at the time of the feet, aren't we? Because Jesus still hasn't come back and the Roman Empire isn't here. But, that's what we're going to talk about for a few minutes. Because what metal still exists at the very end of time? Iron plus clay has now been thrown in the mix. So we've suddenly got a non-metal. Clay has been thrown into the mix. And as the Bible as clearly says, and it says it on the screen, clay and iron are not a great mix. If you stir the two together, a lump of iron and some clay, they're not going to gel very well together. That is not stable, is it? So really this whole image is stood on something very, very unstable. The kingdoms of men are much more unstable than you think. But anyway, I've put question marks there, but we're going to answer the question marks because it's a very interesting question to say, if the Roman Empire itself ended a long, long time ago, why isn't there sort of a gap between the legs and the feet? But there isn't. It's a continuous thing. And that's what we're going to have a look at. Let me just give you some interesting information here. Babylon existed from 606 BC to 542 BC. The Persian Empire existed from 542 BC to 330 BC. You're counting the wrong way, aren't you, when you're going in BC? It's a bit weird. Greece lasted from 330 BC to 54 BC, and the Roman Empire lasted from 30 BC. I put there 323 AD. Some say it was a little bit longer than that. But give or take, that's where it was. The Babylonian Empire lasted for 70 years. The Persian Empire lasted for 209 years. The Greek Empire lasted for 267 years. And the Roman Empire lasted for 333 353 years. Anybody see anything like a bit of a pattern there? Like quite an obvious thing? They're getting longer and longer. They're getting longer and longer. So in other words, if you're looking at it, when you start with the gold, it's short, right? And the further you go, the longer they get. What is interesting from a metal perspective is that the metals start off weak and get stronger. So gold is the weakest in terms of strength. Silver is the next strongest. Bronze is the next strongest. And iron is the most strong. And in a sense, these empires getting longer could be to do with the fact that the empires themselves were stronger, you might argue, because they lasted longer. So you could say weak going to strong is to do with the length of time that they existed. But the other element, of course, is, well, what's the other way that you could look at those metals? Not just the strength of them.
The brilliance.
You could say brilliance, or you might say value, couldn't you? Gold is far... If I had a lump of gold or a lump of iron, I tell you which one I probably want to take home. So gold is the most valuable, would we say? Then silver, would we say? Then bronze, then iron, and then bronze. Then you've got iron and clay mixed together. And you might wonder, well, why is that? And of course, I think it probably is. I mean, well, put it this way. We all know, don't we, that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were one of the 7 wonders of the world, right? And possibly God is depicting Babylon as the crowning, the crown of it all, the gold, because one, Nebuchadnezzar was in total and utter control of that area. It was a spectacular city, one of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the wonders of the world. And maybe over time, the empires diminished in grandeur. They increased in size, but diminished in grandeur. And the authority of the head of whichever empire it was probably never as great as the authority of Nebuchadnezzar. He was the ultimate despotic king. And over time, by the time you get down to the Caesars, they haven't got as much control. The senates, there's other people involved, there's more debate going on, there's less power. So power sort of drained away as well. So just to throw a few more images up, there you are, most valuable and least valuable. So there's the Babylonian Empire, and there's a picture of what the Hanging Gardens of Babylon might have looked like, and that was ruled by Nebuchadnezzar. And there's a picture. Of course, he made an image himself. In Daniel chapter 3, we read about he made an enormous image of himself, all made of gold. That's another story. There's the Medo-Persian Empire. You see how it's much, much bigger, covering a much greater area. And when you look up about the Medo-Persian area, they taxed everybody in silver. Silver was the currency. And so you can sort of see a link between the Medes and the Persians and silver. There's a lot behind all these slides, as you can imagine. I'm skipping through quickly. The Greek Empire, well, it was known as the Bronze Age anyway during the Greek Empire, because they sort of invented bronze, if you like, and mixing tin and copper together to make bronze. So ultimately, the Hellenistic world, the Greek world was very much focused around bronze, as I say, known as the Bronze Age. Do you think there's any links with the Roman Empire that came next, and iron? Armor was made of iron. That's what the body armor was made from overlapping iron plates held together with leather straps. So the whole army's going into battle dressed in the very material that God had said would be depicting that's a good one. The Iron Fist of Rome. Yeah, excellent. The Iron Eagle. Got it. All very good. So I'm going to move on to this, because what I want to do is just focus in on this fourth metal of the Roman Empire. Because what we're saying is the Roman Empire began in 30 BC, yeah? But we're also saying that somehow or other, the iron is still there when Jesus comes back. The iron still exists. So there's something to do with the Roman Empire that is still in existence, would we say, at the time of the end. The other thing is when you start looking at the Roman Empire, even though the Roman Empire did come to an end in around about 370 or whatever it was AD, it wasn't the end of the story anyway for the Roman Empire. And this is super interesting to look at. And I actually think the book of Revelation deals with all of the development of the Roman Empire from its inception to its conclusion. We know that God is going to set up a kingdom that's never going to be destroyed in the days of the feet on this image, right? Which is where we think we are now. But here's the development of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire actually split anyway into two, which is why there's probably two legs. There became a Western Empire of Rome and an Eastern Empire of Rome. But even that wasn't, so the Roman Empire came to an end ultimately, but it came back on the earth again. Does anybody know what the next version of the Roman Empire was called? The Holy Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire ceased to exist, but some years later it came back on the scene as a completely different setup known as the Holy Roman Empire. And that lasted for almost 1,000 years, by the way. It lasted from about 800 AD all the way up to approximately 1000 or the 1800s, right? So only a few hundred years ago, the Holy Roman Empire was actually still in existence. It was what people call now the Dark Ages. So the Holy Roman Empire existed a long time, but it also came to an end. But then, after the Holy Roman Empire, which covered a very similar territory as the original Roman Empire, but just nowhere near as big, I suppose, but it was still based in Europe. Anybody know what came again? There was another empire that appeared. This one isn't known as much, but do you know the empire that came again in Europe? Nearly, the Germanic Empire. Now, here's the thing. The Holy Roman Empire was known as the First Reich. Do you know what the word Reich means? Empire. The Holy Roman Empire was known as the First Reich, but the Germanic Empire was known as the Second Reich. What do you think came after that? The Third Reich. So you can see there's a story going on here of people trying to dominate this area. And so you can see the story of the iron legs continues. Europe continues to have an ongoing iron story. If you think of iron as an empire, the empire keeps coming back. Now, you can argue, well, what's happened since then? Well, all of those other empires, if you like, were trying to create an empire through force. And the EEC, which eventually became the EU that we see now ultimately, was basically saying, with Germany as the main driving factor behind all of this, was basically saying what we're going to try and do is to create an empire without war. We're going to have a single currency. We're all going to come together peacefully. The project to create an empire through war has failed. So now we're going to do it by bringing all the nations together through agreement, not war. Now, when you look at it, this is what it says in Daniel chapter 2 concerning the feet. It says, the feet and toes that you saw were a combination of iron and clay, showing that this kingdom will be divided. Like iron mixed with clay, it will have some of the strength of iron, but while some parts of it will be as strong as iron, other parts are as weak as clay. So there's some sort of kingdom that exists at the time of the end that has almost certainly got to be to do with Europe, because the whole thing has been centered on Europe from Roman times up until now. And it's a divided kingdom. It's got some strength of iron, but it's also got this new substance of clay. Then it says in verse 43 that the mixture of iron and clay also shows that these kingdoms will try to strengthen themselves by forming alliances with each other through intermarriage. This is a modern translation. This is a New Living Translation. So in other words, it's saying that kingdoms are going to form alliances together through intermarriage. In other words, we're going to mix up the nations. God has created separate nations. So Germany has got its own language, French has got its own language, Italy's got its own language. This is very different to the United States of America. Everybody's of the same language. We've all got different languages in Europe. And the project of Europe is to bring all these people together and to mix the nations up. That's what it is, to form alliances. But this then makes destabilized situation, because you've got nations trying to come together with strength, like we want an empire, but it's very hard because, well, we're mixing in this clay, and we're going to see what's going to happen with the clay. And it says in verse 44 that it's during the reign of these kings that the God of heaven sets up a kingdom that will never be destroyed or conquered, and it will crush these kingdoms to nothing, and it will stand forever. So if I was going to summarize, I think what we've said is, I think the feet have got to be something to do with Europe, which is what Revelation itself tracks from start to finish. It's a continuation of the Roman Empire. Iron equals Rome. Rome equals Europe, and always has done, always will do. And that's the power that it's talking about. The iron is to do with the strength of rulership. If you look at iron all the way through the Bible, and I've put an example there in Revelation 2:27, iron is always to do with the strength of rulership. So you've got Europe wanting the strength of rulership, but now we've got clay. And if you look up about clay, almost every time clay refers symbolically to people. It's people. It says in Isaiah 64 verse 8, God says, I am the potter, you are the clay. So now we've got the strength of rulership mixed in with people. And what this, I believe, is talking about is this on the screen here. People, power. It's the utter opposite of Nebuchadnezzar, that ruled as a tyrant and a despot and had total control. Now people have power, and people can remove governments. Look what's happened with Brexit. The government wanted to be in this system and be part of it. The people said no. The people win and pull this country out. The government didn't want that, did they? David Cameron fell on his sword, basically, after that. He fell on his sword because the government wanted to stay in and the people said no, and the people won. The clay is mixed in and is weakening the whole structure. People power in the context of the EU refers to the concept of citizens actively participating in shaping the future of the EU. Well. This is what the leaders are up against. They want strength, but they can't get it because of the people. You notice it says that in the authorized version, it says it's mingled. The clay mingles, and the version that we've just looked at talks about intermarriage, which is the mixing of races. The whole European project is about mixing races together. And because of all of that, it becomes unstable. And finally, Jesus returns. Just the last couple of slides in the last few minutes. I don't know whether you've heard of the Schengen Agreement. So this is really important. Nobody really talks about this, but it basically says that you can freely mingle, you can freely go anywhere you like without a passport. You can just literally go from one country to the next in those green countries. There, it's the Schengen Agreement that allows people to go backwards and forwards. Just have a little watch of this.
When it comes to international borders, for most countries, they are hard barriers separating people, cultures, money, languages, driving sides, and more, not to mention all the special documentation you will need just to cross that line. However, in Europe, something somewhat mind-blowing has been established. Borders that you can just stroll right across. What? How? Yep, those exist. This such freedom of travel is essentially unique to most but not all of the countries of the European Union. France, Germany, Benelux, Italy, Spain, and several others have agreed to essentially abolish the borders between them and let people move around as they please. This is an area called the Schengen area, and it can be somewhat mind-blowing
So
to
basically,
outsiders.
the intermingling that God said would happen is happening. So they're trying to get an empire, but it's weakened through all the intermingling and the people power that's come about. The final couple of slides is this. Anybody know what that's a painting of? The Tower of Babel. What happened at the Tower of Babel, according to Genesis, was that God confused everybody's language, didn't he? He said, right, there's going to be a German language and an Italian language and a French language and an English language and a Russian language. These languages didn't develop over millions of years. God created the languages there and then. I'm not saying language doesn't change a bit, but he created different nations at that point by creating different languages. What Europe's trying to do is reverse Babel that God put in place. God it was that said you were going to be in different nations. The EU says, no, we're going to get rid of all of that. We're all going to be one intermingled nation. And if you don't believe that, then if you look on the left there is the famous painting of the Tower of Babel. And on the right is the EU Parliament in Strasbourg. And it is based on the exact same painting. They're saying this is a Babel project. We're undoing what God did originally. And if you don't believe that, there's even a European poster that came out in the 80s that said Europe, many tongues, one voice, with the painting there on the poster of Babel. It's a Babel project. The whole 10-toe thing and the whole story of Europe is what then spins into Revelation. Revelation tracks every single element of the development of ancient Roman Empire right up to today. And there's more to come, I think. There's going to be another resurrected Holy Roman Empire coming on planet Earth at some point, and the events with Donald Trump and things like that are moving us into that area. So hopefully I've given you a bit of food for thought. I'm just going to finish with this last video that puts the whole vision that Nebuchadnezzar had into much better graphical terms than I could have done. End of story.